I'm honored to be invited. I hope it's going to come out okay. We're not out at the sawmill right now. We're on my back porch, and that the internet signal out there is so capricious that I figured we would maybe err on the. We've got plenty of footage of the mill, but err on the side of a better internet connection.
Just remember, Dana, if it doesn't work, you're working on it.
Along with Mac and Allison.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think Allison's here, so we can blame her. How about it? All right. Okay, well, I'm gonna welcome everybody to tonight's Talkin' Shop with Garland Mill Timberframes. I'm going to give a brief introduction. I have to admit to having stolen it completely. I'm just reading it to you, folks, but I found the words quite compelling, and I didn't think I could write something better than what Dana wrote himself. So I'm gonna stick with that. So welcome to you all this evening. It's nice to see as many faces I'm able to see and as many names as I'm able to see tonight. And we are going to try, as Dana mentioned, we're going to try to use some technology here. It may succeed, it may not, but I think there's a real good chance. He's got some good people working with him, people who are under the age of 40. And so therefore, I think there's a good chance it'll work. So without further ado, I'll get the introduction underway. As the 9-foot-long yellow birch lever is pulled down, there's a sound of water surging through the penstock into the wheel pit. Then a few thumps and knocks and the straining of belts. The board saw advances weakly. The edger stutters, then springs to life. As more water drives across the canted fins of the hidden turbine beneath, the mass of iron faster, and the floor, in fact, the whole building, begins to rumble. So that was his introductory paragraph from Timberframing. And so specifically, Dan, who's joined us here this evening, and his cousin Ben are the third set of multi-generation family owners of their mill after the Garlands, who I presume is what Garland Mill was named after the Garlands from 1856 to 1895, and the Aldens 1895 to 1974 had their tenures. And so the brothers, Tom and Harry Southworth, acquired the mill back in 1974, and Dana and Ben acquired it, as I believe, in 2010. So this mill has been in operation since before Abraham Lincoln's time, which I think is remarkable. So I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation. And without further ado, I'll introduce one of the sweetest people I know in the Timber Framers Guild, Dana Southworth. Dana, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Mac, and thanks everybody who's here for joining in. I'm delighted to share this. Many of you have been to the mill. I hope many more come. And before we jump into the series of videos, I would also like to briefly thank my sons, David and Robert Southworth, who are with me. They're young and growing craftsmen and aspiring timber framers. In fact, David says we're too small team for him, and he actually next month is going out to work for New Energy Works in New York State, but he was able to squeak in a couple of videos before his departure. So what I'd like to do is show these videos, which essentially follow the article that Mac was referring to that Ken Rower and I wrote a number of years ago about the mill and the basic operations of the sawmill and into our version of timber framing. we have about 4 short videos, and I'd like to show those. In some cases, I'll try to speak in addition to the video, but at the end of each one would certainly entertain questions, comments, criticisms, and we'll just proceed as directly as possible. I would like to, I didn't get it into the article, but wanted to just mention a story briefly that probably many of you heard from Tom and Harry, and that's after they bought the mill and tried to run it just as a sawmill for about 10 years, they had worked through the meager savings that they brought up to northern New Hampshire with them from central Pennsylvania. And after several efforts like building picket fences and horse logging and some other things that Joel McCarty chronicled quite entertainingly and accurately, it really came to a fork in the road. It was either get their wives yet a third job, I'm just joking, or unfortunately let the mill go, just because it was not financially viable in any way, shape, or form. And by some just dint of good fortune, they stumbled onto a Steve Chappell raising over in Maine. And Steve said, yeah, sure, I take all kinds of free labor. Come on over and throw in with us. So it was a raising for a friend of Tom's wife, Nancy, a bookbinder. Anyway, long story short, they went over there, observed what was going on. Steve gave them a couple pointers, and those guys were way smarter and way harder working than I am. And they said, well, you know, I think we can actually try to stitch this together. And so as a value-added product for otherwise just a rough softwood mill, got into timber framing and cut about 3 or 4, 5 or 6 frames before they brought a mortiser, and then another 4 or 5 before they found out about and joined the guild. And I was on my way out the door to college, but that was a moment to remember and absolutely celebrate. They just almost fell on the floor, and 2 men not given to outbursts of great emotion were pretty excited about this crew named the Timber Framers Guild of North America and outlying territories that they threw in with. And it's with great delight that Ben and I try to follow in their footsteps and not run the thing totally into the ground. So anyway, enough of my talking. I'm going to ask David to get the first video going. Can you get that screen share? Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's just go back to tab real quick.
So the boys did a very good job with this. Rather than just jump into my jerking a log into the mill and jamming it across the saw, they actually follow the course of the water. And this is the Garland Brook about 1.5 miles upstream from the mill, flowing down the mountain and coming to a small diversion dam. And to the left of that, which will be upcoming, you'll see there was a hand-dug canal, a canal that was hand-dug in 1856, all the way down the side of the mountain. Can everybody see that okay? Okay. And so there's the water flowing down our side of the brook. So they dug this channel 1.5 miles down the mountainside and then built a sawmill next to it. And this is the little coffer dam that, and the boys are driving down the road, but they're paralleling the stream. We just went past Ben's house. There's Tom and Nancy's house. And there's the sawmill. And so relatively little water this time of year, other than when there's a heavy snowstorm. There's my younger son out just making sure the logs still float. Dog rooting around for fish. That in the background, Mount Cabot, that's the watershed from which the stream springs, named the Garland Brook. And that's the log deck. I think there'll be a couple of shots of David going downstairs and oiling up some of the machines. The technology actually dates from the machinery dates from the 1880s, in that after running it for 20 odd years, the Garlands did a full technological upgrade in the early 1880s. And so all of this machinery, originally it had been an up and down saw. They converted over to a circular saw, but it's still all flat belt driven Babbitt bearings. Davy's oiling the bearings underneath the mill. And I may ask the boys to fast forward through some of the stuff just so we can get most of it in, but we'll you want to just kind of, yeah. And each one of those pulleys is belted to a different machine. The head saw, we've got several planers, an edger, a trim saw, conveyor belts of various form and fashion. That's an interesting 90-degree bevel gear that we gave a little talk on at the Guild conference a couple of years ago. One side of the cog is cast iron or one wheel, the other is hard maple, so that rather than wearing down both metal surfaces, the wood obviously gives way first. And this is hydraulics at the Garland Mill. My Polish son throwing a piece of maple across the ground.
I don't know about that.
And we made this video earlier this week when it was beautifully sunny, 85 degrees. The boys and I spent most of April and May in about 6 inches of snow and driving wind and minus some odd degrees doing most of our sawing, in that the only time we really have enough water to saw at the mill is when we have the snow melt and runoff. So that runs for about 6 weeks from as soon as the ice goes out and the water comes down. But this time of year, we could saw, during this video, we maybe sawed for 20 minutes and the water was completely run down. But somehow they were able to get a subsurface nautical view of a log being pulled into position to be hitched onto a chain and dragged into the mill. The chain gets laid out, and with a pike pole, it gets dragged into the little lasso and captured. The boys are pretty good at it. Ben and I are, not quite so good, but to watch Tom and Harry saw was just magic. They were like music in that mill. This is putting the chain coupling on to actually, it's basically a power takeoff to engage the upper sprocket, which is then connected by a series of belts to the different machines. When the sprocket's off, the generator, obviously, the turbine spins, and it spins a small 30-horse electric motor. So when we're not sawing, we're generating a little bit of electricity to power our shop tools and planers and so forth. And then when we want to saw, engage that upper sprocket and that horizontal shaft at the top. And that's the yellow birch lever that Ken Rower was writing about. As I pull down on that, it lifts a sleeve around the turbine housing, allowing water to flow down into the turbine. And so it's a 900 RPM motor, so that's the belt for the edger. That's the long belt that runs the back shaft. Kind of a Rube Goldberg machine down under there. It would take your arm off here if you're not careful. This is actually pulling a log up into the mill. The total equivalent horsepower of that turbine is about 28 horsepower. So it's laughingly underpowered, but the old timers who built it understood a thing or two about torque and gear reduction, speed increase, decrease. And it produces a remarkable amount of torque, enough to saw through a log in decent shape. So Davy's pulling on a rope that tightens a pulley down underneath the mill and engages this bull chain and pulls the logs in. One interesting thing about this is instead of loading logs through a side gate, we're not limited on length, and I can saw up to about a 35-foot timber without much trouble, which makes nice top plates and long rafters. You don't need to put scarfs in quite so many pieces. Just oiling up the rail so the cant turns all right. All right, so that's the end of number one. The next gets into sawing. I would be I'd be happy to do whatever, Mac, you think appropriate time-wise, either take questions or jump right into the next video and take questions, say, halfway through and then again at the end.
I think you should take questions as you.
Okay, well, why don't we throw it open to any questions of what's been shown so far?
Hey Dana, this is really good, dude. Are you recording your dialogue with the movie? Because if you're not, you should.
I don't know.
It's good.
My
really
son
nice.
maybe, like the boys are probably doing it.
The video's in the background. We've recorded all of the steps of sawing, and he's just dubbing over it right now.
Okay, well, guys, it's really quite good. You should be proud.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We'll skip right in there.
Just curious, is this picture that's showing, is that somebody setting the saw or sharpening it or what?
Yes, that's the beginning of the next video of me actually sharpening the teeth of the saw. So, and if you look closely, you'll notice that I'm only sawing with 1 out of every 3 teeth sharpened. And the reason for that is because the mill is so underpowered that in order to deliver sufficient power to the teeth that are in the cut, my Uncle Tom learned this at a sawing seminar down in UNH shortly after he started running the mill and thought, boy, not a lot of power here. So the old timers would basically file over every second and third teeth just to act as rakers to pull the sawdust out of the cut. But that limited 28 horse was concentrated on those fewer number of teeth in each cut, consequentially taking a larger chip and allowing to feed at a slightly higher rate so the saw doesn't heat up. And all right, so again, back to Polish hydraulics.
One more question, if I may.
Sure.
When was the 28 horsepower also true when they were using the back and forth saw? Because it would make more sense then.
Well, it was probably in that neighborhood, in the 165, 7, however many years that the mill's been in operation. My understanding is there have been seven different turbines in operation. Maybe not that many for the sawmill itself, but in the late 1880s, when it was really a going concern, there was a fully functioning furniture factory. There were about 6 or 7 outbuildings, and so they were all run off the motive power being water. But my hunch is, yes, in that ballpark of 28 to 35 horsepower.
Dana, does that mean they had a lot more water back then?
Well, you know, that's a very interesting question, Mac. I'll try to answer it quickly. I always thought the answer was no. I'm beginning to think the answer is yes, in that in the very early part of the video, you saw the stream up on the mountain. The town of Lancaster has its intake for the municipal water supply just above our little diversion canal. And in that the town, it's still a very small town, but it has expanded that municipal water supply to include a couple large farms. The hospital draws ever more water. So I think that, yes, I think that there is diminished water in our side of the stream, and I don't notice it during the heavy run in the spring when we're pretty much on overflow water. But as soon as the trees leaf out, the northern forest soaks up such a tremendous volume of water, and then there's no snow to melt, obviously, that yes, I think that there is less water now than even when I was a kid. But
so that would explain why forebears had a harder time making a go of the sawmill. Less water.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm saying that there's less water now than there was then.
Like even compared to when.
Yeah. But and I say Polish hydraulics with only the fondest connotations, because my sons are both half Polish. My wife originally hails from that fair country.
That's not a bad thing.
No, it's a very good thing, actually. We tend to visit as often as we can, and it was very regrettable I didn't get a chance to go over and participate in the Zabudov construction, the synagogue reconstruction in Sanok, even though I'd been to that Living History Museum. Just things didn't work out. But
I was there.
Yep. What a wonderful thing. But so this is just affixing the log to the carriage through various old but still functioning compounds and hold downs. That's what they call a sawyer's favorite. It's actually a very handy tool.
That it is.
Sounds like there's a sawyer in the audience, or it's probably several.
Only since 1985.
Wow. Based on how slow I saw, you probably already sawed more board feet in that time, and we have the whole history of the mill.
Perhaps.
It's actually interesting. This first cut, the saw was remarkably dull, and so I don't know how Davey dubbed in the saw sharpening, but I don't know. We're getting a funny. Somehow these boys got a red line on here. Does anybody else see that red pencil line across the screen?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah, and we've seen it before. It's from something else.
Oh, okay.
And there it goes. Now it's back.
Yeah, without a top saw, sometimes on the first cut you need to cut through the top side of that slab. But it's a story for another day. But I'm actually putting in yet another electric-powered sawmill on which to act in conjunction, not replacement of this. Well, we'll have a top saw. So.
Good idea.
Well, just 4 out of the 5 mills that we have bought additional timber from over the past decade, or 20, 30 years, have gone out of business. And I don't want to get caught in a position where I can only saw for 6 weeks a year when people are ordering frames. That even a non-astute businessman like me realizes that might not work. So this is the trim saw Davey's working on. It is operated. He is pushing down with his right foot on a lever that is attached to a counterweight and brings a 30-inch blade zinging up out of the floor. It looks pretty docile from this angle, but it can be daunting. So it's not particularly fast, certainly not powerful, but it's sawed a lot of timber in the past 165 years.
What size of saw?
It's I saw with a 50-inch blade.
Okay.
Nice piece of easy cutting white pine. And we do probably 70 to 80% of our frames out of white pine. It really is pretty exclusively a softwood mill. Can cut red oak without too much trouble. I cut cherry for furniture work, but rock maple just brings it to its knees. This is the slab chain. We cut the offcuts into firewood length pieces and dump them out in the pit for local folks to come and get them for firewood.
Is that about your maximum depth of cut, Dana?
Yes, we can cut essentially 21 inches in the clear from the top of the arbor nut to the top of the tooth. And then the different pieces and timbers, we send them out the back of the mill on a little chute. As you can see, I still haven't cleaned up from a bunch of the spring sawing that the boys and I did. But boy, it sure has taken that Sawyer a long time to whittle his way through that log.
It's a big log.
Well, I was hoping to get a 10 by 16 out of it. I think I settled for a 9 by 13 just because I've got a frame that requires that size plates. But no, Robert, Navy, and I, because of the the COVID situation and the closing of schools, these guys did their schoolwork in the morning and came and sawed with me in the afternoons, and we actually sawed up some pretty good sized timber, at least for East Coast standards. Well, we must have sawed a dozen 30-footers or so. Mm-hmm.
How many bunks on your carriage?
How many rails? 5. Actually 6. There's one headrail too.
Okay.
And this is an edging machine. There are 2 blades in there. It'll just cuts the wane off. And we don't have a kiln, but I'd say out of every 5 or 6 house frames we do a barn frame, and it's really nice to be able to use our off-cut product. We air dry it and put it through various different planers and molders, and try to use everything except the squeal. Local farmers come and get the sawdust, and we trade them eggs and sausage and otherwise. How are we doing for time? In terms of video? Okay. The old joke of, thank goodness it was timber framing came along because the only thing a sawmill makes money on is the sawdust and the firewood. Well, the slabs fall into a conveyor that goes out to the side of the mill and dumps into the dump truck. But being water powered, it's remarkably quiet, other than the noise of the blades and the belts flopping. Okay, got one more cut on this girl.
Dana, do you saw all your timber for your timber frames, or do you supplement?
We supplement. I would say in the 33 or 35 years we've been cutting frames, we probably have sawed 35 to 40% of the timbers. What we try to do, Mac, especially is focus on the specialty timbers, because I like to cut the bigger and the longer sticks that are harder and more expensive to buy from other mills. And it's pretty easy to get up to a 16-footer. It's hard for many of the local mills around here to do much better than 20 feet. And so I can cut most all of my single piece plates and the more specialty sticks. Robert about to send that thing for a ride, and so. All right, so I think that's the end of the sawing operations, and we'll be happy to answer some questions and talk about any of that detail before we get into what we do with the timbers after they come out of the mill.
Got a quick question.
Sure.
The mill, I guess, is quite a national treasure. How many other mills like that are operational left in the country? I can't imagine a whole lot.
You know, that's a very good question. I don't know that, but yes, the mill is on the National Register of Historic Places. I do know that Bob Spurl, who's involved with the Guild, runs a water-powered mill for the state of New Hampshire down in Portsmouth, but I think that's more a demonstration mill. I've heard that there's a mill up in Nova Scotia, I think, that still works commercially, but I don't actually know of any other water-powered mill that operates on a commercial basis. They're probably all way too smart.
There's a Hope Mill up here in Ontario. I don't know if you could call it commercial. It's attached to what's called the Lang Pioneer Village. They do cut and sell some lumber, and it's a very similar mill to yours in terms of it's a 48-inch circular blade, and it's all belts. And I've had a very brief tour, well, Dalil and I, but it's part of an association that's mostly involved with, you know, historical. Anyway,
it's run by volunteers.
It's run by volunteers, but they do sell product.
Yeah.
But they're not cutting 30-foot timbers.
They cut.
Whereabouts is that?
Hope Mills is near Keene, Ontario, south of Peterborough.
I'd love to come up
not
and
so
see it.
far.
That sounds neat.
Yeah, it's a great group of people, although they're aging.
They make birdhouses and fence boards and
Mhm.
probably other things too.
Yeah.
They have a neat little solar kiln that they built.
Yeah, their solar kiln's really cool. That might be something for you to collaborate on. Who knows? I don't know. It just depends on your air killing might work just fine.
Well, that's something that we've been thinking about. My father wanted in the worst way to build a solar kiln, and he never got quite to it. But if we step up production with an auxiliary mill, I think that a solar kiln is in our future. We just put about a 30 or 40 kilowatt array on some of our timber drying sheds, so we're going to have some excess electricity to help push the fans. So
the one these guys have is, as far as I know, strictly passive, but you could really up the capacity if you could add fans. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Huh. Well, boy, that sounds like a field trip in the making.
Yeah, and you could stop by our place. Be great.
Well, I mean, I would. Well, why come if we couldn't see you? So.
Sign me up.
All right. Shall we continue or?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you comment on water rights?
No, but that's an interesting question. That's a very good question. We are under the understanding that and the town, we're in very good graces with our town, but we are the understanding that we're grandfathered to utilize as much of the water, bring as much of the Garland Brook, the stream, down our side as is needed to continue operation. So we can't obviously be greedy and run the other side dry. But if done with common sense and measure, we're allowed to, yes, utilize and manipulate the water in an appropriate way.
Is it possible to build a reservoir or have a tank up there that you could sidetrack a small amount of water so that you could do runs later in the year besides those 6 weeks?
Unlikely, just in that it's hard to tamper with waterways these days. I mean, even putting in an innocent holding pond or something like that, I think would probably not be as easy to get through as it might have been in past years. We do, however, have a pretty good sized pond in front of the mill that does impound the water and that we store our logs in. So.
Doesn't power your mill though.
What's that?
My name's Chuck Bolton, and I'm an architect, and I live in Southeast Michigan. And recently, over the last couple of years, I found 2 examples of a, sawn to camber beam, tie beam, in some barns. And you might have some interesting perspective as to how you would run that through the machine, because I haven't quite figured it out. But I've only seen 2 of them.
Well, roughly what was the camber they put into it? Do you know?
They go from about 8 inches where they join the corner posts to about 14 to 16 at the center.
Okay. Do they then recurve back, or is it just a continual taper in one direction?
No, they cut back. So they're only 14 or 16 inches in the center. So it's basically, there's 3 cuts to that face, one would say.
Right. It would be on a band mill, you could do something, or an up and down saw, more easily than on a circular mill. I mean, it's sort of like making a cut with a bandsaw or a jigsaw as opposed to a handheld circular saw. But I do have taper adjustments on our carriage that I can set, and if I was brave or very careful, I might be able to minutely adjust those as the cant passes through the saw, but I'm not willing to try.
I was wondering what the degree of difficulty was on the people who were doing it. But as I say, I haven't seen it.
People are clever. I mean, you can set up a jig to do almost anything. I know, I mean, it's a bandsaw rig, but I know that Glenn Dodge, one of the true timber framing jewels of the world down in southern New Hampshire, is able to, on his bandsaw mill, to cut some very, very interesting curved stock. But again, running it across a band mill as opposed to a circular mill is a whole different kettle of fish.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So this is just kind of a high-speed tour my son took through our timber yard and some of the timber sheds. I guess very high speed. And this is an old 1912 or 1915 American, so-called by name, American timber sizer that I picked up about 10 years ago. So we didn't have to bring every single timber back into the mill and plane it a minimum of 4 times across a single side planer. It's a little newer vintage than the Sawmill, but it's still flat belt Babbitt bearing, and it's been a game changer for us in terms of, because we do primarily mill rule frames, and just being able to plane the stock that we saw without back-breaking labor is a big help. It's not run on the water power. This is a separate building off to the side. Runs on a diesel power unit that I had been all fired up to run on French fry grease with biodiesel. But we've got serious bears in our area, and apparently bears will tear apart anything, including chain link fences, armored protection, otherwise, to get to the French fry grease. So it still runs on straight up diesel, but not too much of it. So Davey's looking at some of the different settings. It's a very, very intuitive and easy machine to set, even for a kind of a farmer type like me. And we're putting a couple babies through it. Just, I think a 16 and then a third 26-foot 8x10. But the planer will plane up to a 12 by 22 or 20-inch timber. Very basic, very reliable technology. It just takes regular oiling, sharp knives, good belts, and it just, a machine like this is probably built to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for forever. The hardest part for us was actually moving it, because it weighs about 17,000 pounds. And that live edge piece didn't go through the planer, obviously. That's something that Kyle Whitehead and Glenn Dodge are working on a community project, or will be once the world gets back on keel, and cut this up and going to take it down and donate it to their project. That was actually a piece of rock maple that the boys and I sawed this spring, and surprisingly, it sawed out okay. Didn't wreck the mill. All right, so that's the end of video 3, and maybe before jumping into just a couple shots of the guys fitting some timber together, I'd answer any other questions.
Can you describe a Babbitt bearing for me?
Yes, a Babbitt bearing is, as opposed to a roller bearing, which has a sealed unit with a series of roller bearings in it. A Babbitt is basically a compound which includes large part lead, but also zinc a couple other metals that I don't recall exactly, but it creates, it is shaped, there's a bottom cup or a bottom concave section and a top concave section, and the shaft that runs the machine rides in that Babbitt material, which is poured in molten form into a cast iron bearing housing. And there are small score marks in that Babbitt into which oil is introduced through a hole in the top of the bearing case. And so the idea is that the steel shaft rides in a very thin film of oil being held by this Babbitt. And when there's a gap in the oil or when metal comes in contact with metal, the Babbitt wears down more quickly than the steel, so you don't destroy your shaft. And so probably we have to re-pour bearings, I would say every 10 to 15 years, we actually have to scrape out the old Babbitt and re-pour those.
I've got a planer that has a bad Babbitt bearing, and we've been looking at replacing it. Our local machinist is trying to push us towards sealed bearings. But he does Babbitt as well. Any thoughts on newer stuff, or just stick with the Babbitt and keep it greased?
Well, if it's been working, there's probably no reason not to stick with it. I would say, however, that if you're in a high tension situation where you really want to tension the belts onto that particular device, that particular bearing, a Babbitt bearing, if there's a lot of belt pressure on it, will heat up worse. You'll deal with heat issues as opposed to a seal bearing that you can really refill the belts.
These are all direct drive with electric motors.
I think you'd be fine. I mean, I run not only these machines, but I've got a small furniture making company on the side, and a number of those machines, jointers and a table saw, run on Babbitt bearings at high speed, 3,600 RPM, and haven't had any problem with them.
Thanks for the advice.
Yep. Now these are just a couple of the guys. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to know more about the logs in the pond business. Like, how long are you leaving them in there? What's the story with that? And how much fun is it to run around on those?
Well, it's a lot of fun until you fall in April. The reason let me just take a step back. I try to buy most all of my logs in the winter, so they're logged and skidded across snow as opposed to dirt, not getting rock and gravel and grit ground into them. And so I'll have them dumped on the side of the pond, or they just set them right out on the ice pack. And so I like to try not to have a log sit in the pond for more than a year. But being in the water, the fiber stays soft and easy to saw. The bugs don't get into them very badly. The only thing that we've seen happens is if one side gets waterlogged, no pun intended, the bottom tends to be heavier, obviously being in the water. It doesn't rotate. And so at least with the white pine, you can get some blue staining of that area that is not fully submerged in water. But I've had sawed logs that have been in the pond for 2-3 years and no structural defects whatsoever.
How long, Dana,
You're looking
you
incredulous.
pine beetles that away from them?
This is what it looks like when you fall in the
Oh, this was spring sawing. The boys out for a little fun, and a sequence of Davy about as graceful as a baby moose getting out of the swamp. Well, there he goes. And that water was probably 34 degrees. But
that's on my bucket list of things I want to do someday.
Yeah, well, come on up. I mean,
I might.
there's no science to it. It's just
They had log drives up here on the Ottawa until like 1985 on the Ottawa River.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. That's
I've sawn
cool.
logs
Yeah.
out of the Ottawa River that were probably in there for over 100 years.
My, what species?
White pine mostly, but
Mhm.
everything. They had poplar because there was a splint mill in town, so there was a lot of poplar too. But
Yep.
mostly white pine was what the Queen wanted.
Yes. Yep. Yep. Interesting. Well, that sounds like fun. And
It was no sap in the logs, but they're like
yeah.
saturated. But there's no terpenes in the logs at all anymore.
And hardened up into pure resin.
Yeah, or just got washed completely out.
Yeah, washed out. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, okay, one more small question. Do you know what the moisture content is of a timber you've sawn after it's been sitting for 3 years in that pond?
As it comes off the saw.
Essentially, yeah. It seems to me like it would be soaked. I was kind of curious how that works.
Well, they are. I mean, a freshly sawn pine timber is, well, I should prick one with a moisture meter, but 30% or better. But the white pine dries very quickly and quite in a stable fashion. We try very hard to keep the bulk water off it. So after it's sawed, and I'll put it out in the field and let it dry for a month or so in the nice spring breeze. Also with us, blue stain, we with a lot of people who work in pine really dislike that intensely. And blue stain only will grow in conditions that are above 20% moisture, but also basically above 80 degrees, 75 to 80 degrees. So you can get away with having them outside and air drying in the spring, which is the best drying time, but you have to get them under cover if they're still above that 20% moisture, which they will very likely be before the temperatures rise and water sets on them. And so we built a series of timber sheds a couple of years ago after trying every other alternative with a lot of frustration, and presto, the blue stain problem is gone. I mean, why should it be so tough to have to fight it for 20 years and finally just build a cover for it? But I don't know if that answered your question. All right, well, we've got about 5 minutes left. You want to see just a couple shots of some of this water sawn timber being knocked together into a bent? Or, well, I guess Davey's charging ahead. This was a mix of spruce, butternut, and cherry. We scribed it up, and actually we're built in the background. We're rebuilding that mini bent that holds up my slab chain. It completely rotted to pieces, so we figured, well, why not do something a little bit fun? And this is just the back side of the mill. Actually, that's right where the wonderful food tent usually gets put up when we hold guild rendezvous events at the mill. And thanks to Mac's encouragement, we're going to be doing that more and more often. We try to do one every 5 or 10 years, and maybe we'll start doing one every 2 years. But you want to speed through it?
Yeah.
Oh, and this is just finishing off a frame we just put up last week. Again, some of the timber sawed this spring, most of it sawed last spring or last fall, but just a fairly simple little salt box for some folks who we built a house for 5 years ago, and they wanted a place to put some of their machines. So, and that was the little cabin, and I guess that pretty much does it. That's the video. Thank you for your patience in putting up with all that.
Oh, amazingly right on time.
Well,
fantastic.
thanks to my technical advisors. I would have been blabbing and boring you all until midnight, but Davey kept kicking me under the table saying, Dad. Thanks, Davey. So anyway, no, really, thanks so much for your patience. Thank you, Mac, for inviting us to do this. And yeah, we look forward to getting as many fellow guild members up here for a rendezvous as quick as we can.
We'll make sure and give them adequate notice about the opportunity to come up there and socially distance themselves while they're at the Garland Mill, which sounds like a really safe place to be. So thanks so much, Dana. It was really interesting and intriguing. And we're going to try to we're going to see if we can't get the videos from you and see if we can't somehow string them and put those up as well as this recording. I think the videos would actually play well together if we were to connect them and put that up as well on YouTube, Dana. So we'll see if we can't memorialize today's very interesting. As Bill Hurley said, really a fine job. Very, very good. Thank your sons for us, Dana, if you would please.
I will indeed. I will. And,
really appreciate all the time and effort.
Okay, and anytime. You guys.
Thanks, Dana.
It's a great family to be part of. So we'll can't wait to see you all in person. Socially distanced, of course.
Yeah, of course. Next week, folks, we have Jean-Philippe Letarte from NTC Solutions who will be speaking on connector tech. So until then, we'll say thank you and good evening.
Okay.
Good night. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Night, everybody.
So long.